So let's kick off. So these are the pillars of good cancer medicine. So the basic principles are it should be a multidisciplinary approach. It shouldn't just be the oncologists, it's about nurses, doctors, palliative care, surgeons. It should be based on good medicine, holistic care, not just drugs. It's about looking after nutrition, exercise, sex, psychosocial, financial issues. It should be about explaining clearly, and Lesley's walked out on me, very rude, and listening to the patients. And that means multidisciplinary working, evidence-based medicine, and essentially clear information and appropriate support. And this is what I'm going to be talking about, evidence-based practice. So, bench to bedside, what does it mean? Bench to bedside means taking the research in the lab into the clinic. It's the bridge that gets the drug from the lab into patients and registered. So, preclinical is the research. When we use it routinely in patients, it's been licensed. The FDA, EMA, MHRA have licensed the drug to be used routinely. That means a clinical trial. So it's the bridge, trials are the bridge that changes medical care, that improves lives and saves lives. Without that bridge, we would be in the caves with a bit of, peppermint oil or something, whatever you can find in a cave. It is key. Okay, we would not have the advances was it not for trials, okay? So let's talk about preclinical research very briefly. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. So preclinical research is where no patients are directly involved. We may take bits of you and use it, but no patients are directly involved. It's cell lines. It's basically taking cells and growing them in Petri dishes. These are cells which can grow and grow and grow. We use those. We do use animals, and we're using less animals, but we need to accept good clinical research at the moment needs animals, unfortunately. Although there's a great move to move away from it. Grants have to justify using animals. There is a push to move away from them, but unfortunately we still have to do that. And we need to accept that and reflect on that. We use human tissue. We also use lots of clever computer modeling and computer programs. So what is preclinical research about? It's about identifying the target in the cancer cell. So what is the target we need to take out? It's about developing the medicine to target that target. So how do we hit the target? And it's about how toxic that medicine is before we give it to any patients. The other thing is about sweat and serendipity. We've got to remember every breakthrough involves people, involves ideas, hard work. So these are three very key individuals in the history of estrogen receptor positive breast cancer. Elwood Jensen. In 1958, he went to Vienna, not to see the dancing horses or drink or eat the cake or go for a dance. He went to present his paper saying, I think I know why some breast cancers grow with estrogen. He went to the room and there were 5 people sitting in front of him, 3 were other speakers. The rest of the audience was somewhere else saying, we think we know the idea about breast cancer. There were 2 competing models. One was that breast cancer, hormone-positive breast cancer or estrogens drive breast cancer by having lots of domino effects in the cell. Elwood said, that's rubbish. This is about a receptor that goes into the nucleus and drives it. Nobody believed him. But he was proved right and showed that hormone breast cancer is driven by the estrogen receptor. I'm unclear why he never won the Nobel Prize, because he's the father of basically hormone receptor positive breast cancer and how we treat it, and actually other receptors. Pivotal figure in the history of breast cancer and how we treat it. Craig Jordan. He took a failed contraception and made it into a drug that saved hundreds of thousands, not millions of lives, tamoxifen. Tamoxifen was a failed contraception. He took it from the bin and made it what it is. Angela Brody, born not far from here in Manchester. Who's on arimidex, anastrozole, exmestane? Who's on it? Aromatase inhibitors? She developed it. She was the lady who developed aromatase inhibitors. She once gave my old boss a bag of drugs. He took across the Atlantic and did a clinical trial, the first trial to show the activity of first generation aromatase. So behind every breakthrough, there are people who work very hard, who are often not acknowledged in their work. So remember, behind every advance, there are people and stories to tell. And there's many more stories I could tell, but I haven't got the time. Ellen set me up quite nicely talking about DNA being changed into proteins. The proteins build the wiring system, and the wiring system is sort of signaled through by these things that sit on the surface, receptors that take signals from outside the cell and send them into the cell. So they basically developed the wiring system. Now, as Ellen very eloquently said, when we get mistakes in genes, either we have lost the genes and they don't make stuff, or they make too much, and we have too many instructions. So take HER2. Everybody in this room with breast cancer would have been tested for HER2. Now, about 15 to 20% of women have too many HER2 genes. That means too much protein, the engine's really jammed down, accelerating. It makes the cell misbehave. So you can see how you get a change in the DNA, too much signal, too much protein, too much vavavoom in the cancer cell, it misbehaves, okay? Example of understanding how DNA damage or changes leads to bad proteins. I'll come back to this in a second, just to give you an example about how the wiring system gets changed just by changing the DNA. So I'm going to change a bit to talk about drug development. So this is basically what preclinical work is about. It's understanding what makes the cancer cell tick. That's what preclinical research is about. So let's talk briefly about how we might target this, how we get drugs. So I'm going to give one or two examples. So let's talk about chemotherapy. These are drugs from war and Mother Nature. So, I'm very interested in history. I think history teaches a lot. So basically, in the First World War, as many of you know, we were throwing around mustard gas like it was going out of fashion. It was used as chemical warfare to clear the trenches by both sides. It resulted in men being blinded and suffocated. It led to some beautiful descriptions by the soldiers, particularly Australian and New Zealand doctors for some reason. They wrote many of these papers, which described the changes in the bone marrow of the soldiers exposed to nitrogen mustard. Now, that was filed away, and people said, isn't that nice? Come the Second World War, the Allies were really worried that the Germans would use chemical warfare in the theatre of war. We know what happened outside the theatre of war, but they were really worried the Germans would basically use nitrogen mustard in the theatre of war. So Roosevelt's administration at the time in the US had started a very secret government program to develop antidotes, not new weapons, but antidotes to those mustard gas weapons in case they were used in the theatre of war. And in fact, there was mustard gas scattered around the theatres of the Second War. There's a famous instance where an American ship got bombed in Bari Bay and all this mustard gas got leaked. Thankfully, it was never used in the theatre of war. But from that work, they discovered a mustard compound that they found killed cancer cells on mice. They decided, let's test it on a human cancer. The gentleman in the picture, he still remains nameless to this day. All we know, he was Polish. He emigrated to the US. He worked in a ball bearing factory, and he was admitted to die to the hospital where he was treated for a nasty lymphosarcoma. You can see the lumps of tumour on his neck. He was dying, basically. On the 7th of August 1942, he got the first of 9 injections to treat his cancer. It worked for a short period, but it worked. There were a number of examples in that case. It was an MDT. That is the first example that's written in history, at least in our journals, of intravenous chemotherapy being used for cancer. It came from a secret government war program for mustard gas, published in 1946 because the evidence was suppressed because it's a secret government program. Okay? That's just one example how we just come across a drug from a program. The other thing is Mother Nature. Mother Nature is scattered full of plants, as we know. These plants have given us drugs. Pacific yew, paclitaxel. Basically, somebody took some Pacific yew, ground it up, put it on some cell lines, it killed cancer cells. That led to the discovery. Japanese sea sponge, eribulin. They found this compound, part of sea sponge. They basically then synthesized it. It's now chemotherapy. So we get drugs by grinding up bits of Mother Nature and putting them on cell lines, and we see what works. And then that's how we get drugs, okay? So this is serendipity and basically testing lots of agents that we get from Mother Nature, okay? One example how we get cancer drug. The other thing is we design them. So everybody likes a bit of Gucci, a bit of Dolce & Gabbana. We all like, a little bit of designer stuff. We all like a bit of designer drugs as well. They're expensive as well. So once we understand what drives the cancer cell, we can design drugs to block them. And this means taking the receptor, we've got this outside, inside, this big structure, understanding how it moves, understanding the pockets, because often these receptors have pockets, grooves, and basically jamming them. So we do it in 2 ways. Either we can develop antibodies. We take the protein, inject it into animals. When we have a bacteria or a virus, we produce antibodies. We can do the same with bits of cancer. We can give them to animals, and they produce antibodies. We purify it, and then we can use it to track cancer cells. So monoclonal antibodies, if you're on Herceptin, it blocks the key. The key can't get in, and therefore the signals can't generate. So monoclonal antibodies are key, they block the keys. They can't, the molecule that would go there is blocked, and that works. Or we can jam the lock. These are small molecules, sucatinib, palbociclib. They get into the cell, and they block the lock. So even if the key's in, lock's not turning. That's how these small molecules work, okay? So either you block the key, or you jam the locks. And that means designing them, computer programs, understanding the structure, making the drug to go in. So, but they're all designed. They are designer drugs. And we use lots of clever chemists who can make these things. Because once you've got a drug, you've got to dissolve it, make sure you can put it into a capsule, or you can inject it. So you need lots of clever chemists to take the molecule and make it such that we can give it to men and women. So one slide, because Bookie's got to do the main talk on this. Once we've got the drug, we've got to test it on patients. So we've got phase 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I'm going to leave that to Bookie to go through. But essentially, trials about how much drug do we need to use and when. How does the body handle the drug? So we take poo, urine, blood. What does the drug do to the tumour? Sometimes we'll ask, can we do an extra biopsy to understand what the drug is doing to the tumour? What are the side effects? And more importantly, does it shrink the tumour and how long for? And then the sort of phase 3, the sort of World Cup of studies is it better than current treatment? Should it be the new gold standard? Okay? And Bookie's going to cover all that. So let me tell you a story. I'm going to take you through the story of HER2, the revolution that basically has probably saved hundreds of thousands of lives and has meant women can live with their secondary breast cancer for many, many years, and some women for many decades. So, in 1985, the code for HER2 was discovered in humans. They found the code, and they found in some cancers, the first cancer that they found it overexpressed was salivary gland tumours. So I don't understand, I've read the paper many times, I don't understand why they picked salivary gland tumours. They picked it, and that's basically, that black and white picture is the DNA basically pulled across an electrical charge, and the big two black blobs is the salivary gland tumour. It had vast amounts of HER2 in, and that was the first time that we found the code for HER2 and that it was expressed in vast amounts in tumours. The first step forward. Then they said, actually, in breast cancer, what does this mean if you have lots and lots and lots of HER2s? And it was bad news. This was the first paper to show that in 1987, if you had breast cancer and you had lots of HER2, you did badly. Your survival was worse if you were HER2 positive. So the first evidence that having HER2-positive breast cancer was bad news. Again, this was done on the DNA of the tumour. They ground it up and then did this sort of electrical block. So now we know it's bad news. How do we use to treat it? So they took some animals, they took the HER2 molecule, and they injected it. And basically, the mouse developed antibodies. They took those antibodies, gave it to cancer cell lines. The 4D5 is the antibody that killed the HER2 cell. So that shows you that line going down is good news. That's the antibody killing the cancer cell. That 4D5 became trastuzumab. It was basically attached to a human antibody, and the 4D5 is the recognition. It knows that's HER2, but that's mouse antibody on a human backbone. That is the antibody that's still used today for trastuzumab. So the question is, does it work? Did it work? Come 2001, the pivotal paper, the paper that had transformed the treatment of HER2-positive breast cancer. It was the most massive step forward that said if you give chemotherapy and trastuzumab, women survive longer. That was the first stepping stone to the revolution that led to massive changes and improving the outcome of women with HER2-positive breast cancer. It also told us it affects the heart. So this was the first paper that showed heart failure and that you shouldn't give it with anthracyclines, but it also told us a new safety signal. So this is a really basic snapshot of how we go from a science finding through to a drug that's now saving lives. And after that, we've had evolution. We've had pertuzumab, TDM1, TDXD, sucatinib. So you can see how we've gone from a finding into medicine that's transformed the lives of women in decades. Only happened because of the trials. So all this then happened because of the trial, okay? So that Slayman paper is a trial. If that trial didn't happen, who knows where we'd have been. And there's a whole there's a whole interesting story about this discovery and Dennis Slayman, how he got the patients, and how he worked really, really hard to make this happen, and almost this didn't happen. I mean, Fatima knows the story probably as well. It was really hard work. So, I'm coming to the end. One more slide. So, in summary, good medicine is evidence-based, and that means research. The journey starts with lab research, and it's hard work, and a bit of luck is needed. It's about defining what makes a cancer cell tick. Drug development is how you design the drugs to hit those targets once you've got them. New drugs come forward, need clinical trials. They tell us, are they safe and do they work? Ultimately, all our steps forward rely on patient altruism and patients going to clinical trials and being able to access them as well as being willing to participate. On that note, I'm going to say thank you and over to Buki.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. In case you're wondering who Buki is, I'm Buki. My name is Dr. Olubukola Ayodele, fondly known by Buki. I'm a consultant medical oncologist with a background in drug development. I trained in Princess Margaret Cancer Hospital in Toronto, Canada, before I came to Leicester. And now I head the breast unit in Leicester, and I'm in charge of the portfolio for breast cancer in Leicester. So today, I have actually titled my talk, How to Speak to Your Oncologist About Clinical Trials. And I'm sure people are wondering, why this title? And the reason is that being offered a clinical trial is like a postcode lottery right now. So it depends on where you are. If you are being treated in an academic center, then you're most likely going to be offered a clinical trial. But there was a report by Make Seconds Count in 2024 that showed that only 23% of oncologists actually offered clinical trials to patients. And I think that's terrible. So it's time for you to arm yourself with the information that you need, because I think the recurring theme throughout the summit so far is that you have to advocate for yourself. And if you're being treated in a district hospital or you're being treated in a general hospital, your oncologist might not offer you clinical trials. So you might be the person to say, you know what, I have read about this. What's the story here? And if you do come to your oncologist at that point, they'll have no choice but to talk to you. So I'm hoping that you will learn some things today that would help empower you to have that discussion. So today I'm going to talk about understanding clinical trials, preparing for the conversation, key questions that you can ask, what it means by making an informed decision, and after you decide to participate in a clinical trial, what it involves. So what are clinical trials? Because I'm sure you've been hearing clinical trials, clinical trials. What are clinical trials? Clinical trials are actually structured research that involves humans, and it's to assess an intervention. So that intervention might not actually be drugs. It could be a new tool. It could be a new surgery. It could be a new type of radiotherapy. It could be even behavioral intervention. And sometimes it could be that we know drugs that already existing, but we want to combine them in a different way. So clinical trials doesn't always have to be drugs, but in the context of secondary breast cancer, most of the times when we talk about clinical trials, we are talking about drug trials. But as Ellen mentioned earlier, you can have a clinical trial like Target National, which is a diagnostic tool looking at ctDNA or liquid biopsy. So you have to remember that if you're being offered a clinical trial, it doesn't always have to be drug-related. And also, why do we do clinical trials? It's basically looking at what we call safety and if the drug is effective in this new intervention. And it also contributes to what we call evidence-based medicine. So Carlo just talked about how we've gone from bench to bedside and how that has revolutionized things like trastuzumab that has changed the world of HER2-positive breast cancer. So it does help us in making our decision. So what are the myths and the facts that we know about clinical trial? So let's start with the facts. Clinical trials are not just the last resort. This is things that I hear every day in clinic. People think that when you're offered a clinical trial is when there are no other options, but this is really wrong. Clinical trials can be offered at any stage of the cancer journey. So when we talk about metastatic breast cancer, every treatment you get is called a line of treatment. So for example, if you're being diagnosed today and you start a treatment, that treatment is first-line treatment. When that treatment stops working or the cancer starts growing and you go on to another treatment, that's second-line treatment. And you can have that as long as possible. So you can have clinical trials at any point in time during the journey. So it doesn't mean that it's the last resort. So that's a fact. A myth is that you might get placebo or a sugar pill instead of treatment. That's not true. So if you're going to have placebo, it means that it's being combined with what's called standard of care. So you're not allowed to have just placebo in a clinical trial. So that's really important. Another fact is that your participation is voluntary, no matter the timing or where you are in your clinical trial. And because people feel like, oh, I've signed the consent, they're having doubts, and they just continue on the trial, you can actually withdraw from a trial at any time. And it's very important that you know this. Also, the myth that I've heard is that clinical trials only test rare or experimental treatments. That's not true. Like I said, sometimes we might be combining drugs that we know already existing, but we're combining them together for the first time or in a different dose. So that's really important. So what are the phases of clinical trials? Carlo really touched on that very quickly, but I'll go into that. So the first one, or it's called phase 1 clinical trial. And what phase 1 is talking about is when you come from preclinical, so you've tested this drug in the lab, you've seen some activity, but then you're coming into humans for the first time. And you hear the words like first in human. It just means that it's being used in a human being for the first time. And what happens is that you get a small group of people to trial that on. Those small group of people could be multiple cancer types. It could be the same cancer type, but it's the first time it's being used. And the primary aim of a phase 1 is safety and dosing. It's actually not efficacy, which is how effective the drug is. It's because we want to know, is this drug safe for the very first time we're using it in humans? And what is the right dose we should be using in humans? So that's the whole point of a phase 1 clinical trial. Obviously, the secondary point is that we want to see if it's effective. So we will be checking patients on a phase 1 trial with CT scans or whatever modality that you're using. So that's also very important. But remember, the primary aim is safety and the dosing. Because what happens at the end of a phase 1 trial is that you get what is called a recommended phase 2 dose, meaning that this is the dose that we have seen the kind of manageable or acceptable toxicity, and we feel we can open it up to a larger group. And you then move to the phase 2. So phase 2 then is, we've seen that there's a bit of activity here. We now know that this dose might work. Let's prove this concept a little bit more. Let's recruit more people into this group and see, does this truly work? And we also want to see what the safety signals or what the side effects are. And then you move to phase 3. By the time you get to phase 3, you're very confident in yourself, because what phase 3 does is that it's going head-to-head with what is considered standard of care at that time. And you want to prove superiority. You want to prove that your drug is better than what is currently existing. So that's what a phase 3 is. And that's why it is randomized. So what randomization means that and the randomization is done by a computer. So we have no idea how this goes. So most of the times in my clinic, the randomization is done in the morning, and that's when people know who is getting what. But the randomization can be what we call open label, meaning that we know what patients are getting, or it could be double-blinded, meaning that we have no idea what patients are getting. And I usually tell patients when they're being recruited to a phase 3 trial is that you might not get this new drug, and that's really important because patients come into clinical trials expecting to get a new drug, but in a phase 3, you actually might not get the new drug. You might be randomized to what's existing, but that doesn't mean you're getting less care because that's what's existing right now. So that is actually the standard of care. It doesn't mean that you're getting less treatment or less effective treatment. So that's really important. And the phase 4 is basically marketing. We're checking long-term. This drug is out there, it's been licensed. Are there new signs that we're concerned, new symptoms, new safety? That's what the phase 4 is. So what are the benefits and the risk of participating in clinical trials? And I'm sure people are wondering risk, but I'll go into that in a bit. So what are the benefits? Definite benefit is that you have access to a new drug that's not existing to the public. You have regular monitoring, so higher frequency of scans. You have a constant access to a monitoring team on a clinical trials team, but also you're contributing to research, and this is really, really important. What are the risks? Well, the risk is that there are side effects. Yes, there's side effects to every drug. So even if you're on a standard of care, there are side effects. But I've put this here because of things like a phase 1 trial where we are learning for the first time what the risk could be. So you could be experiencing something that we have no idea of. So it's really important that you know that. Also, in terms of the uncertainty about how the drug is going to work, and I think we've said that earlier on, there is no drug that works 100%. So the fact that you're even getting the new drug does not mean that you're going to have, or it's going to work. It's until we give it that we will know that. So how do you prepare for your conversation with your oncologist? I think it's really important that you do research, and I'm sorry that it's come to this. This is a broken system, unfortunately, where you have to empower yourself. Ideally, you shouldn't be the one to have to go and do research about what clinical trials are available, but unfortunately, this is your life that you're fighting about, so you need to put a little bit of work in it. And that work involves doing a little bit of research, going to accurate information places like clinicaltrials.gov, Cancer Research UK, the NHS Clinical Trials database, but most importantly, Mel is going to talk about Make Seconds Count UK Clinical Trial Registry, which is really, really important if you want to find out about clinical trials, because that helps you know about whether you are eligible for a trial or not. What do you gather? What are the information that you need? This is really important, especially if you're being referred to another center. So you could be based, for example, in Leicester, and you're being referred to London or Manchester. Don't assume that your oncologist has sent all your information. Please make sure you gather all the information that you have, your current medication, your treatment records, whatever thing that's going to help you on that day, because you want to maximize that visit to that oncologist you're going to go and see. So it's really, really important. I think this, for me, is one of the most important things. You have to bring a support person if you have one, because that person is just not another figure in the room. They're there to bring emotional support to you. They help you to recall. Like I always say, it's very important to have another set of pairs of ears in the room. And also, they might help you ask the right question. Because, for example, if you're going somewhere that's not your local oncology department, you could be overwhelmed by the fear, the new environment. You might get there and not ask the right question. But when you have someone with you that you've taken, then they can ask that question if you get overwhelmed. So that's really important when you go. So what are the key questions you should be asking your oncologist? I think definitely you need to ask what type of clinical trial you're going to get on. Is this a phase 1 clinical trial? Is this a phase 2? Is this a phase 3 clinical trial? These are very important. Another thing you need to talk about is the clinical trial process. What's involved in the clinical trial? Because there are some clinical trials that you might sign a consent for something called a pre-screening. It doesn't mean that you've gotten on the trial. And for some people, that might be disappointing. So for example, I have a trial open up called Pavement, where we're looking for androgen receptors in triple-negative breast cancer. You need to sign a pre-consent that would allow me take a biopsy or a tissue from what you have existing to go and test. That doesn't mean, when you sign that, it doesn't mean you're already on the trial. It's until the result comes back saying that you have that receptor positivity, then you can come back and get on the trial. So you need to know the steps involved in whatever trial you want to get involved with. Also, eligibility criteria is really important, because you might see something on paper and you think you might be eligible for it, but there might be some little nuances. For example, you might need to have been exposed to a certain drug before you might be able to get on that trial, or you might just be able to get a certain line or numbers of treatment, otherwise you become ineligible. So all of these things are important questions to ask. Also, the enrollment status. Something might be showing up on the internet that it's open, but it's actually closed. So it's really important to check all of those information, but also your own health concerns is really important to have that conversation and discuss. When I talk about potential side effects and outcomes, this is really important. If you go and see your oncologist, you need to talk about this. And they give you something called a patient information leaflet, and that tells you about the potential side effects that you may get on the trial, and also the expected outcomes and people that you can reach. And because it's only after this that you can make what's called an informed decision. And even though we're having a chat with you on that day, and in your mind, you want to get on the trial, you're raring to go, we cannot take consent on that day. We need to allow you to go, mull over the information we've given you in that patient information leaflet, and then decide for at least 24 hours before we sign the consent. It's really, really important. Also, what you need to talk about is how does this impact on your current treatment? Because sometimes we get a trial, we see that we're eligible, we're very excited, but we can't get on the trial. Why? Because you're still stable on your current treatment. And you can only get on that trial when the cancer starts growing and the treatment stops working. So simple things like that are very important to consider. So in terms of making an informed decision, you make it together with your oncologist. It's a collaborative decision. I think one of the things that was pointed out in that it's written off report by Make Seconds Count is that a lot of people didn't feel they were involved in their care. So it's really important that you have that conversation, and your personal preference really matters as well. So also the things to consider before making a decision is, what is the logistics involved? You know, if you're based in Leicester, you're going to Manchester for a trial, where are you going to live? How are you going to get there? You know, and I can tell you with clinical trials, your frequency to the hospital is more. You have more appointments because there's more blood work, there's more tests being done. So you need to consider all of that very well before saying yes. So these are very important logistic things to consider. Also, it's important to ask your family or your support network, whatever, you know, just have a chat with somebody else. It's your decision at the end of the day, but it's good to just have a discussion with someone else, and that would be really helpful. So what then happens after you've decided to participate? Well, you're going to have regular assessments while you're under treatment. we're going to participate, or the study is going to be as per what we call a protocol. And what is a protocol? A protocol is a set of rules that we've put together prior to the start of the clinical trial that ensures the safety of the patient, ensures that the trial is conducted in a humane fashion. So it's gone through what we call the ethics board, they've gone through it, and it also allows for structure and consistency throughout the clinical trials bit. Also, it's important that you talk to your team while you're having the trial. So once you're on the trial, when is the results going to come out, when is this going to stop, all of those information is really important because it then helps with anxiety, but also having your support, knowing who to contact while you're on a clinical trial is important. So what's the conclusion? It's really important to be honest and open about your communication with your oncologist. It's important to prep, as much as I don't like it, this is where we are. It's important to have that conversation, and informed decision is really important. So my final thoughts and encouragement is that you are the best advocate. Don't hesitate to ask the questions. Your oncologist is there to help and find the best treatment for you. Clinical trials can be, it doesn't always. Sometimes you don't fit, and it's okay. You need to know that. Sometimes you just don't fit. As much as you want to participate in a clinical trial, it might just be that at that point in time, it's not the right fit for you. So it's always your choice. So we're going to keep the conversation going. We're going to ask questions afterward, and I'm going to hand over to Lesley.
Thanks, Vicky. I think that was really interesting, and I hope it's given you all a bit more of a better understanding of clinical trials and the way they work. I've not got any slides. I just want to talk for a couple of minutes about my own personal experience of being on a clinical trial and how that came about. And so I was diagnosed de novo in 2014, over 11 years ago, with metastatic breast cancer. And I think, like all of you in the room, I was just thrown into this really deep, dark place where I thought I was about to die, and it was just horrendous. And I didn't know anybody else who had an incurable cancer. But a friend of a friend put me in touch with somebody who had a blood cancer, and she was being flown down from Edinburgh to the Royal Marsden every month and getting treatment. And the pharma company were paying for that flight. And I remember I met her and I was amazed. I thought, gosh, a trial might be, if I can find a trial, that might give me another treatment line. And it certainly gave me a lot of hope. So I spent the next sort of 18 months or so. Most of the treatments I was on actually failed me. Herceptin didn't work, Kadcyla didn't work, capecitabine didn't work. So, and in that time, my lung mets were growing and growing, but I would spend literally hours on a database called clinicaltrials.gov. Has anybody here looked at it ever? It's not very patient-friendly, is it? It's terrible. But I would persevere. I was so determined to live because I've got 4 children and we all want to be around for as long as we can. And I would compile a list and I'd send them to my fantastic oncologist, Larry Hayward. A few people here in the room have got him, I think. And he took the time to go through those and say, that's not suitable, that won't work, blah, blah, blah. And eventually we got to the point with my treatment where he said I had to get my affairs in order, about 18 months after being diagnosed. And I remember we went off to New York as a family, thinking that was my last holiday, genuinely thinking that. I couldn't go up the stairs, there was so much cancer in my lungs, I was just breathless all the time. And I came back and he said, right, I've got a line of chemotherapy I can give you, or there's the last place on a phase 1 clinical trial at the Beatson in Glasgow, which was just a short, 40-minute train ride away. So I jumped finally at the chance of getting onto that trial, and I was extraordinarily lucky. It was just the perfect match for my cancer, and within 2 weeks, and after the first set of scans, the cancer had really been cleared from my lungs. And I stayed on that trial for 7 years. So I would not be standing here without getting on that trial. Now, it wasn't all plain sailing. I did have some what's called oligoprogression, where just a single tumour might pop up here and there. But the oncologist I was seeing, those of you that were in the HER2 session will have heard Ian McPherson. So he was looking after me for 7 years, and his team. It was like whack-a-mole. They would just treat it with radiotherapy and reduce that tumour. One case, the tumour was close to my heart, so I had a lung lobe removed. So that was the most serious situation. And we just carried on like that for all those years, and that enabled me to get into the work I do now, which is patient advocacy work. Eventually, unfortunately, there were too many. It was clear that the drug was starting to fail, and I had to come off that trial. And I've been on several different lines of treatment since. I'm currently on my last line of treatment, which is a bit of a worry. But when it fails, hopefully not for some time yet, I will be looking for another clinical trial. And my experience on that trial was really, really positive. And as Buki said, you get very personal one-to-one care. You're really well looked after. And they put me up in a hotel for the first week or first few nights, actually, when I was having to get blood tests done every hour on the hour. So I would really, if you get the chance, I would really try and go for a trial. And it gave me, I guess I got quite passionate about it. I thought most patients, as Buki's already said, and as the survey that Mel is going to talk about in a bit more detail showed, that most patients aren't offered a clinical trial, and there's a lot of myths around them. You think you'll be given a placebo, you think you have to wait till it's a last resort. If you wait till then, you might not be well enough to go on to that clinical trial. So I just wanted to share my story, and I'll hand over to Mel, who's going to talk a bit more about the survey and what we discovered and what we as a charity have tried to do about it.
Thanks, Lesley. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Melanie Tolson, and I'm the lead clinical trials nurse with Make Seconds Count. And what I'd like to do is go over these two key areas here. Look at an unmet need in trials, which is basically, I'm going to go over this report that Buki and Lesley have mentioned already. It's called A Little Bit Written Off. You can read it electronically on our website. We can give you the link for that, but actually there's hard copies of these on our Make Seconds Count table out in the stall area. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the sort of key headlines from the report and how Make Seconds Count, what we did with that information, that data, and what we've done to bridge the gap, as you will soon discover. Okay. So a little bit written off. So it was a study to understand the clinical trial experiences and needs of people living with secondary breast cancer. And it was a national survey, and it covered many aspects of people's experiences and views related to clinical trials, and was open to people with secondary breast cancer diagnosis. It was launched in May 2021 throughout the entire UK. 768 people took part, and the way they were able to do that was advertisements of these in NHS hospitals that they could take part in the survey, through other charities like Breast Cancer Now, CR UK, our own website, It Makes Seconds Count, and Maggie's centres as well. So there was information in all those places that you could use to take part. Okay. So, from the report, there was various barriers came out of the survey, and these were patients' views on certain issues that they experienced to do with information about clinical trials or certainly lack of information. So most patients had never engaged in a conversation with their oncologist about a clinical trial, and the study showed that only 23% of oncologists had raised the subject of clinical trials with patients, and Buki's already mentioned that's really low, and it's really disappointing in this day and age. 32% of patients had raised the subject themselves with their clinicians. Again, that's quite low, but obviously you'll discover that was due to lack of information, probably the support and guidance that they needed to feel brave enough to put their head above the parapet and actually have the conversations, which is not easy. I know that's not easy. When asked how they wanted to receive the information about clinical trials, the vast majority wanted to receive information from a trusted healthcare professional. So that's your breast care nurse specialist, your metastatic or secondary breast care nurse specialists, your treatment nurses, your oncologists, whoever, okay? And only 39% of patients felt very involved in making decisions about their treatment. And again, that's reflected in Buki's discussion there about being an advocate for yourself and again, being brave enough to ask the questions. Okay. So, another barrier that came out of the survey was perception around clinical trials. Patients encountered many misconceptions around trials. These are some quotes from patients that we've used in the survey. My oncologist was very unsupportive. She said most trials fail and should only be ever used as a last resort. Absolutely not. Trials, as we've already heard, can be at any point of your cancer treatment journey. Okay, so that's a myth. There was fear of being given a placebo, and again, Buki's addressed that. You'll never be given a placebo by itself in a clinical trial. It would be combined with other standard care of treatment, so you'll always get treatment, even if it's the standard of care, which is the current gold standard for that treatment lineage. Many were worried or said they were treated as a guinea pig. Well, none of you look like guinea pigs. And I certainly wouldn't want to be having hot flushes and all that fur. So I'm glad we don't look like guinea pigs. But you are not guinea pigs. You are human beings that deserve quality of life by being involved in these trials and hopefully finding newer medicines and combinations of medicines that we can pay that forward for the generations of secondary breast cancer patients to come through. Okay. Another quote, I think this is a perception that I was given that you only go into a trial when everything else fails. Well, we've addressed that. That's absolutely not true. And trials are for when you have run out of options. Again, not true. Could be true for some people, depending on how many lines of treatment they've already had. And sometimes that's maybe where the phase 1 trials might come more into play for some of you. But again, there is clinical trials when you're starting to fail the NHS options. The third barrier that patients picked up on was accessing trials. And this is a big problem out there for you all. Patients surveyed described that the barriers they perceived in terms of access was there was a disparity of research, funding and resources available for primary versus secondary breast cancer. So I think basically they thought all the money was going into primary breast cancer trials and there was nothing for yourselves. Again, not true. The distance patients are willing and able to travel to access a trial. Some people were willing to travel, well over 2 hours to go into clinical trial and upwards. That, and again, that's logistically something that you would need to consider in your own life. They were worried about rigid exclusion and eligibility criteria. And again, we've said that there is things that you have to meet, and they're not, not everybody's going to meet the criteria. And sometimes it's just there's a blood result's not quite right, or a heart scan result's not quite right, and therefore you feel that kind of eligibility screening, sort of pre-screening phase before you can get into the main study. And it is disappointing, but hopefully protocols, they're there for safety reasons. We can't just put anybody into the trial. It's got to be safe. So they also looked at their clinical trial experiences. Only 14% had taken part in a clinical trial. That's low. Well, I think that's very low. However, I think that these were patients who had been in a trial in the primary breast cancer setting, and actually, had they not been in that trial, their secondary breast cancer may not have been diagnosed as quickly as they had in their follow-up and monitoring. 72% described taking part in the clinical trial as a positive experience. It's not bad, but nice if that was higher. But Lesley's had a good experience. Travel expenses were not reimbursed for 66% of trial participants. I think if it's a trial that is backed by a big pharmaceutical company, they usually have pockets of money to help with travelling. Some of the more sort of educational trials that we do, or they're more run by hospitals or collaborative or hospitals together, maybe ran sort of through NHS funding, so they maybe don't always have the money streams to fund travelling, but it's worth asking the question and considering it. Patients described the positives they experienced, such as additional care and monitoring, which had led to the early detection of metastases in 10 cases, and they liked having access to a specialist nurse. So there's usually another different research team looking after you, as well as still obviously communicating with your normal team that look after you. Okay. And it might be they're the same teams depending on where you can access your trial. And the negative experiences were poor communication, travel, and the psychological impact of being in a clinical trial. It is a commitment, but as Vicky said, you know, even though you've signed up for that trial, doesn't mean you need to be in it forever. If you decide it's not for you, or something else happens in life and you just feel you can't commit anymore, that's fine. You just need to tell the trials team, and you can withdraw from the trial. Okay. They'll probably still want to use the data that they've collected in you in an ideal world, and again, you can say yes or no to that. But if you need to come out the trial, that's fine, and your oncologist will just rethink and say, okay, what we're going to do next? What's the next treatment that we could try? So we took all that information, and as a charity, Make Seconds Count said, well, what are we going to do with that? So as you can see, there's lack of information, there's lack of communication, there's myths, there's knowledge to impart to you all. And we know it's not easy to get into a clinical trial either, or search for the trials. So we bridged that gap. And lo and behold, the birth of the clinical trials service came about. It used to be called the Patient Trials Advocacy Service. For some of you have used the service before, and I know some of you in the room have, but we've rebranded in the last sort of 6 months just because we feel that's easier to understand. It's a clinical trial service. So if you go to our website, and you can see the link at the top, that is also in the brochure that you've all got in front of you for the 3-day summit. You'll see this picture of me looking like I'm straight off the set of Casualty. That just tells you a bit about me, but essentially what I want to do now is do a practical how to book a trials appointment with me, so that we can have a discussion about trials. And, you know, if that's all you want to do, that's fine. You don't necessarily have to have the clinical trial search done, but it just allows you to have that one-on-one conversation. It's bespoke to you, and we can see what trials up and down the country we can come up with. Now, if you only want a trial search done in your local area, that is fine. Some patients want the whole of the UK search just to see what's out there, so that we're not ruling out any opportunities for you. Okay, so you'll see, is it that? Yeah. When you go to the website, so that's what you're going to go to, and it's in your brochures. You hit that booking form button. It will then take you to a 4-page form that you need to fill in electronically. So this is just a screenshot of page 1. But essentially, it's going to ask you about your contact details and where you live, your breast cancer type. So that's, are you triple negative, are you ER positive, HER2 positive, are you HER2 positive, ER negative, are you ER positive, HER2 negative. So if you know your subtype, pop it in. If you don't know, that's fine, because we go over that on the call. Where your disease is spread to. So whether it's bones, liver, lung, brain, wherever. If you know it, pop it down. You'll also get asked about whether you want to give feedback about the appointment. Now, it's completely anonymous, and you would get an email in about 4 to 6 weeks after the appointment, and it's just a really quick 5-minute survey. It's the only way we can change what we're doing. If you don't tell us what we're doing wrong, we can't change it and make it better for you all. So be honest if you want to do that survey. There's also a bit about data protection policy, and then at the end of all this, you then have to remember and actually book an appointment. Sometimes people fill the form in, but they actually forget to book the appointment. So, booking the appointment is going to take you to Calendly. I don't know if you've heard of Calendly. Quite a lot of companies use it for, diary appointments. So, we've got 2 types of follow-up This is the one you want to book if you've never used the trial service before, okay? And it takes about an hour. So you're going to hit that one there where it says view booking page. If you've spoken to us before and you just want a quick refresh, or you want to go over a trial that's maybe been sent to you, or you want to ask some specific questions, you could book this one, which is a half-hour slot. To be honest, most people will book this regardless of what the scenario is, okay? And that's fine. So you're going to book in this one. This will come up. This is from March. At the minute, there's a few appointments left in July, but there's about a 6-week, I don't want to say waiting list because it's not, it's just we're fully booked. So some people will book an appointment when they have got scan results pending and they're not sure which way their treatment is going to go, or if their treatment's going to need changed. The time to think about clinical trials when there needs to be a natural change in treatment, and that'd be, because your disease has progressed, or you're maybe having really bad side effects from your treatment, that we've tried to combat that with other complementary medicines or decrease your dose, but it's still not achievable, so it might be we need to change your treatment. But usually the people that need their treatment changes because there's been progression of disease. So, just go back. Choose a date that's suitable. It will bring up a list of appointments. You choose which one you want, and that will book it, and you'll get an email confirmation to say that's you booked for that date and time. At Make Seconds Count, we also get an email from this system so we know who we have to phone on which date and time, okay? Takes about 45 minutes to an hour, the appointment. We go over trials, so very much a discussion about what Bookie's already done, the different phases, eligibility, the informed consent process. We'd also ask you about other conditions that are non-cancerous that you have, any medications that you're on, if you've had any genetic or mutation type testing done, and if you know those results. And it's okay if you can't remember, don't worry about that. We can usually work it out by some of the drugs you're on, or it might be you want some information on mutation testing and genetic testing, and we can point you in the right direction for that as well, which is usually to the target national trial actually that was mentioned earlier. We go at your pace. So if all you want is a conversation about trials and you don't want a search done, that is fine as well. It might be you just want to digest the information and come back and have a search done later. And you can just email us to say you'd like a search done, or you can book another appointment. Go over any questions you've got, clear up any myths, which we've kind of done today anyway. And then if you want, we do a search for trials, okay? Now, I tend to use the databases that have already been mentioned today, the clinicaltrials.gov and the NIHR, which is the B part of research. We don't own those databases at Make Seconds Count. We have access to them, just like anybody can access them, and we use them to filter what might be suitable trials for you based on all your pathology results, all the treatments you've had already, other medications you're on or not on, that kind of things. We have to base it on all those criteria. You then get the search emailed to you directly, okay? We don't email it to your oncologist, we only email it to you. We don't put you forward or into the clinical trials either. It needs to be a discussion with your oncologist. So at some point moving forward, you need to feel it's the right time to mention that you're either interested in clinical trials, and that might be the first step you want to take, and then maybe further down the line, if you've had a search done, you might want to say, actually, I know you're not changing my treatment at the minute because I'm stable, but what about trials? What about these if I do progress? Now, it might be those trials have closed to recruitment by the time that conversation happens, because unfortunately, we don't know when the trials are going to close. We have a rough idea, but the databases aren't always accurate. So just bear that in mind. So if you've not needed to use a search for, say, maybe over 6 months, come back to us again and we can do a fresh search. Okay. And as I say, you need to discuss it with your oncology team. So that's me. Thanks for listening.
Okay. So maybe I'll stand up. She's bringing. Okay. So any questions from the room? We have a couple of questions online, but maybe someone in the room?
Okay.
Okay. But
We have a wrap-up session tomorrow that Bucky and Lesley are on as well, so we can pick up some questions then maybe as well.
Okay. Let's do a couple of
okay. Any question? There's one there.
By the lights.
Can't see.
Yeah, no, it's the lights, isn't it?
Hello. Can I just ask you, when you finished being on a trial, will you be told whether you were on the new drug that's being tried out or not? So do you actually find that out? And will you be given the result of the trial once it finishes? And the second part of that, do you end being on a trial either when there is progression or a trial for a set period of time? What normally happens with that?
Thank you. That's a great question. So in terms of the trial, it depends. So if it's a double blind, we don't know. So until the results are out, you actually don't know. But once the results are out, then they'll let you know. You can ask for your results or you'll be told the results. So for example, you go to a conference and we're now presenting the data or it's been published, then you will then know. There are other times where you might know. It's something what we call unblinding. If you get unwell and we don't know how to treat you and we really want to know, we can then ask the sponsor. So a sponsor is the person who is in charge of the trial. We would ask them that, can we know what drug you're getting because we need to treat you because you're unwell. So in those scenarios, those are the times that you might know the treatment you're getting if it's a double-blinded trial. In terms of finishing the trial, it can be both ways. So it could be that you're coming off the trial because the cancer has started growing or there's progression, or the trial comes to an end, and that happens. And I've had a patient who did really well. So triple-negative breast cancer was on treatment for 2 years. The trial finished, but because she was getting benefit, they actually gave us the treatment free of charge, and she continued the treatment. So it's either ways.
Can I just add that on my phase 1 trial, there were only 11 patients, and unfortunately, I think most of them eventually died. And the trial was never moved to phase 2 in this country, but like Buki just said, because I was doing well, I was given compassionate use access and just stayed on it for as long as I could.
Okay. Any other? There is one hand over there. While she reaches you, there are a couple of questions online about that I think we already addressed this, but the questions keep coming about if we go for a clinical trial only when there is progression or when the disease is stable. For the vast majority of trials, it's when you need to change the treatment. There are a couple of trials that are asking different questions, and you may be suitable to go even if your cancer is stable. But in general, as a rule, it's when you need to change treatment. Okay? Please.
Hello. In November last year, I got a few clinical trials from the service. And is there any way of strong-arming your oncologist? Because I gave them to her and she just put them in the bin. And she said it would take too long to get on one and I shouldn't bother.
I mean, I think that's rude. I mean, I think, professional courtesies aside, I think if you've gone to the effort of getting information from a charity, I accept it's hard work. In a clinic, we're busy, 50-minute slots, we've got more patients. But I think to do that, is rude, I think. You got it, and I'm slightly upset that a colleague would have done that. I would have gone somewhere else. I would have spoken to your CNS and said, actually, how do we get that? Or phone pals. and I would have, found other ways to raise that behaviour, because that's disrespectful. I mean, I think that's just disrespectful. I think it's rude, it's disrespectful. I would never do that. I mean, I might say, look, I haven't got time now, but I'm going to take it away, speak to somebody, get my CNS, I'm going to get my CNS to look at it. I might do a quick glance. I might say, look, these studies don't. But to put it in the bin is actually really, really bad.
Did you ask for a second opinion? No, but you can ask for a second oncologist, though. I think this is what people don't know. So you don't have to stick to one oncologist, unless maybe there's only one oncologist in your center, then that might be slightly difficult. But then you can move to another center and ask for it. But it's your right to have a second opinion. So in that scenario, I would have asked for another oncologist, because you've put that work in. And like Carlo say, it's really, really shocking that someone would do that. And I cannot believe that a colleague would do that.
I mean,
yeah, and then you just ask for someone else.
I mean, I think it's a valid point. It does take time to get on trials. So if you sign the consent, you've got to be screened, CTs. They want to know your inside leg measurement sometimes. It really is a bit of a marathon. It's not like you sign consent today and you're on it. It can take 2-3 weeks to get on the study. And some patients worry because you've got cancer, they've been told it's getting worse, you need new treatments, and now you're sitting there thinking, why are they doing all these tests and it's taking so long? So it needs patience, but that's not a reason not to do it if you're eligible and you're happy and you understand the steps that are needed. So I think if that happens to anybody in the room, speak to a CNS, phone pals, but, I think that there would have been a better way of doing it without making the consultation longer. There were other avenues. Take it outside the room, get a CNS. Marina.
I mean, I'm not in defence of that, and it's difficult to understand. I think we're struggling to understand that someone would do that. But I can understand in certain situations where it's the time and timing and referral. No, I agree. I'm not condoning that behaviour at all. But I think sometimes it can take a month to refer to a new centre for someone to pick the referral up, to put you into a clinical trial, and then you have the build-up of screening, patient information, and then the slots to come up. And we run a lot of trials at our centre, and sometimes we cannot start people quick enough, and we can see very clearly that things are getting worse for them, their symptoms are getting worse, and we're getting nervous. No, I don't understand. Yes. So, and I wonder if those are the things that she was thinking about but didn't say it. And, you're often stuck with the oncologist you have. And I know people hesitate to go to PALS, to complain. But try and work with your teams, because the oncologist in your local area or the team in your local area are often the people you have to stay with. And it's not that easy to travel very far if you've got children. But
the other thing to speak to a CNS, because if the CNS says, look, you've just upset Mrs. X by something you said, they should listen. They should be able to reflect on their behaviour and actually be able to think, some people sometimes have bad days. We all have bad days. Yeah. We're not all perfect and saints. We all have bad days. Yeah. So, but,